This is Ralph Sass, and this is the lecture for Accounting 212, Chapter 1. Just talking about some accounting concepts here and getting us started, so to speak. The first thing to realize is the difference between financial and managerial accounting. Financial accounting is basically required. It's looking historically and on what's happened in the past, and for that you need to follow GAAP and IFRS accounting. Everything we're going to be talking about this semester is managerial accounting. Kind of the rules are off. Okay, we can do whatever makes sense because it's going to be used, looking at the future, and it's going to be used by our internal managers to make decisions. So last semester in financial accounting, where everything was, you had to follow GAAP and what have you, and the focus was historical and making sure that we had receipts and what have you. It was objective and verifiable. This semester, kind of the gloves are off, so to speak, and we're going to take a look at what makes sense for our particular organization. This class is probably today one of the more important classes, and the reason is because of how things have changed over the last 10, 15 years, what have you. And things like increased competition, it makes it much more important that you know the price and the profitability of that product before you sell it. Okay? The other problem, and it's kind of related, is accelerated innovation. You may be making a product that is only out and available for 2 or 3 or 4 months. If you misprice it for those 2, 3, 4 months, you may have lost your shirt. So you need to make sure that you price it, and you price it from the get-go at the appropriate price, because otherwise you could be out of business. In addition, there are more choices. People have alternatives, so you need to be able to provide those alternatives, and when people come to you and ask for those alternatives, you're going to need to know how much does it cost. And finally, there's greater and greater competition. There's a greater emphasis on low prices, what have you. So it becomes ever more important to be competitive, to know exactly what your costs are, so that you can price your product appropriately. Some different types of costs. Just kind of, and we'll talk about a couple of these items in the next couple of slides here on various items. Direct costs are costs that can be easily traced to a product. Okay, I can easily trace direct materials. I can trace that steering wheel that I just bought to the car that I'm going to put it on. I can trace direct labor, the individual that's going to put that steering wheel in the car. I can directly track his labor. Those are direct costs. Indirect costs are costs that cannot be easily traced to a particular unit. Okay? Things like what we call manufacturing overhead. In a couple of minutes we're going to have some examples of what some of those types of items are, but things such as the supervisor's salary, the heat in the building, the electricity in the building, we can't trace that to a particular product, so that's going to be overhead. Okay. So those are our indirect. Sometimes they may also be called common costs. So let's take a look at direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead, starting with raw materials or direct materials. Raw materials are things that become an integral part of the product, okay, and can conveniently be traced to it. My steering wheel, my tires, the radio in this example, all of those things are direct materials and can be directly traced to this automobile. We can then talk in terms of direct labor, and those are labor costs that can be easily traced to that individual product. Once again, and I've used this example even earlier, that wage is paid to the auto assembly worker. And then finally, we have manufacturing overhead, and these are costs that cannot be traced. And it consists of 2 parts. It consists of indirect materials, okay, going back to that car example. Some of those lubricants used, they used a squirt of grease perhaps on part of the wheel someplace or what have you. There's no way to trace that that little bit of grease or whatever, or the cleaning supplies that were used. And then we have indirect labor, okay, and those are the wages paid to those employees that aren't directly involved in production, already used. Supervisors may fall in there, maintenance workers, janitors, security guards, all of those are not directly involved in that production. Two other costs that we can that often get that a firm has that we need to be aware of are non-manufacturing costs, and usually they fall into two major categories. For those of you that have had me before, I'd often use the abbreviation. We often do SG&A, selling, general, and administrative costs. And those selling costs are the costs necessary to order and deliver the product. And the admin costs are all executive, organizational, and clerical costs, kind of all other. Okay, that's kind of my general there. Those are not manufacturing costs. They are not going to show up in the cost of the product. Okay, they are not going to show up in the identified cost of the product. We can also make the distinction between product and period costs. And product costs are those direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. And the way they're going to work their way, if you will, through the income statement and the balance sheet is they're going to start off as inventory, which means they're going to start off on the balance sheet. And then when we sell them, they're going to go into cost of goods sold and show up on the income statement. So that direct materials, the direct labor, and manufacturing overhead is going to show up as an expense in cost of goods sold. The period costs, the selling, general, and administrative, are purely an expense and show up directly on the income statement. So what this means is that auto production worker that's putting that steering wheel on the car, his labor is going to show up as inventory until that car is sold. Then it's going to show up at Ford as cost of goods sold. The people working upstairs doing the accounting, whatever, their salaries, even though they're both working on the same Thursday afternoon or whatever, their labor salaries are going to get directly traced to a period cost and show up directly on the income statement. Two forms of costs that we should be aware of. One is prime cost, and prime is direct material and direct labor. And then conversion cost, which is direct labor and manufacturing overhead. And the way to think about that is the direct labor and the manufacturing overhead is necessary to convert the raw materials into that finished good. A little bit of a difference here, and we saw this last semester, even though we didn't necessarily talk about it at the time. Okay, merchandisers, which we talked about last semester, buy the finished goods and sell the finished goods, things like wholesalers and retailers. What we're going to be spending more time on this semester is manufacturers, and especially in the first couple of chapters here, because what they do is they buy raw materials, turn it into some finished good, and then produce and sell that finished good. Okay, so what we worried about last semester was merchandisers. What we're going to worry about this semester, at least early on, are manufacturers. Okay. If you take a look at the difference between a merchandiser and a manufacturer, we do have to realize that they do have different items on their balance sheet. The merchandiser, the retailer or wholesaler, he buys that merchandise inventory and puts it on his balance sheets. A manufacturer, on the other hand, has three types of inventories. He's got raw materials, those items that are on the shop floor or whatever that have not been processed yet. He's got work in progress. If you want to think about it from the auto manufacturer's standpoint, there is stuff that's going down the assembly line as we speak. That's all work in progress. And then when it's sitting out there on the lot ready to go to those dealers, that's where it finally becomes finished goods. So, raw materials are materials waiting to be processed. The work in progress, as I already mentioned, is partially complete products. And then finally, finished goods are those products that are all done awaiting sale or resale. So notice what happens, and really there's not a lot of difference here. A couple of terminology terms, and then calculations become the much bigger portion. Last semester, when we did a merchandising company, we began with beginning in inventories. We added our purchases. That gave us goods available for sale. Then we subtracted ending inventory, and it gave us cost of goods sold. In many ways, the same thing occurs. This semester, a manufacturing company is going to have some amount of finished goods inventory. Okay, then they're going to have some goods that they finished during the period, the month, the quarter, the year. That'll give them the goods available for sale. Then they'll take a look at what their finished goods are, and that'll give them their cost of goods sold. That's going to show up on their income statement. Okay, the finished goods inventory is going to show up on their balance sheet, but keep in mind they're also going to have raw materials and work in progress also showing up as part of their inventory on their balance sheet. Basic equation, and we've seen this all forever, if you will, in accounting. Our beginning inventory, what did we begin with, plus what we added, that gives us the goods that we have for sale. And then of those goods available for sale, one of two things can happen. Either we sold it, or it's still sitting in inventory. So those are the items that are continuing to go on, and that identity, that equal sign, has to hold. We also need to worry about how costs react. Okay, is it what we call a variable cost or a fixed cost? A variable cost is one that varies based upon, in this case, the number of texts they sell. It could be if you're sitting at home, the electricity based upon how many kilowatt hours you use. If you're driving in your truck or whatever, it's how many gallons you use, or how many you use 1 gallon, it costs you $2 or $3, whatever the price of gas is. If you use 2, it's going to cost you 4. If you use 3, it's going to cost you 6. Okay, and notice, even though the variable cost, and I'm going to go back one slide here, got to go back 2, I guess. Notice that the total texting bill is continuously increasing. But what it does also mean is that on a per text basis, it's constant. In the case of electricity, it might be 10 cents per kilowatt hour. In the case of gas, it might be $2.30 a gallon of gas. So it, even though it's variable in total, it's fixed per unit, in this case per text. Fixed costs are fixed in total. Okay, here they have a contract fee for your phone. Your rent is a good example of a fixed cost. Every month that you've signed that lease, you have to pay them $750 for rent. Okay, and that doesn't change, if you're there every night or if you spend half the time at your boyfriend's house or out of town or what have you. It's consistent. But notice, even though it is fixed in total, okay, a little sidelight here, the things that drive costs, and we're going to come back and talk about this in chapter 6 or 7, are things like machine hours or labor hours or miles driven. Those are the items that are going to determine what happens to our costs. Okay, for example, if you have a car and you drive it for 20 miles, you might have used 1 gallon of gas. If you drive it for 200 miles, though, you may have used 10 gallons of gas. What do we say? We're saying that the miles driven are the activity base. And notice fixed costs on a per unit basis are constantly decreasing. Now, the thing to realize here is just think about the math, okay? Suppose we have a fixed cost of $100, and let's go ahead and make it phone calls, just what have you. If we only make 1 call during the month, that fixed cost is very high at $100. So we have $100 at 1. If we make 2 calls, though, it's 100 divided by 2, so the cost falls very fast to 50. So here at 2, it's down here at 50. And finally, when we get all the way down here to perhaps 100, okay, if we take 100 and divide it by 100 minutes, we get $1 a piece, and now we're down here at $1, and we're out here at 100. So notice that curve falls very fast. So even though it is fixed in total, it is variable per unit. There are 2 major types of fixed costs. There are committed fixed costs, and these are fixed costs that are long-term, that can't be reduced in the short term. A big one we usually talk about is like depreciation on building. You buy a building, you're going to depreciate that over 30 years. That becomes then your fixed expense, your depreciation over that 30 years. It is not going to change materially regardless of how you use it, whatever, and there's not much you can do about it. Discretionary costs, on the other hand, even though they may be fixed, you can, and I'm going to use the word manipulate, and that's probably the wrong word to use, but you can change them or alter them in the short term. Things like advertising. Theoretically, you can call up the paper and stop running the ads, or you can, if you're doing research and development, you may lay off that employee. So even though it's fixed, it is a discretionary fixed account. All costs, and fixed costs in particular, have what we call a relevant range. Okay? And so what happens is you end up with costs that experience what I'm going to call, or we call a step. Okay? Rent is fixed, but you can't have an infinite number of people working in that one office. At some point, you're going to have to, if you continue to hire more workers, you're going to have to rent a bigger building, or rent an additional building, or rent an additional floor, which means your fixed expense, in this case rent, is going to go up. So what we have is we have rent or whatever else, and we're going to assume that it's, for purposes of this class, it's a straight line. For those of you that have me in econ, we tend to draw it a little differently. But for our purposes here, we're going to assume it's straight, and the reason why we can make that assumption is because we're going to assume that it's within the relevant range. This is just a summary, and notice what we have. Variable costs. In total, variable costs change, but per unit, they're the same, or fixed. Fixed costs, okay, are fixed in total, but they're variable per unit. Okay, they're variable per unit. So that's just kind of a summary of what we were just talking about. Okay. Then finally, there are some costs that are mixed. And in fact, most costs fall into what we would consider a mixed cost, in that there is a fixed charge, and then there is a monthly charge per the amount you use. If you go home and look at your electric bill, this is a great example. There is a fixed monthly charge for them to supply electricity to your house or your apartment, and then beyond that, there is some amount that they charge per kilowatt hour. Usually this is going to be depicted, and if you go and take a look at your bill, by some sort of mathematical formula. For our purposes, we're going to use that it's a straight line. And notice what we have here. The total fixed cost, the total cost is the sum of the fixed cost plus the variable cost per unit times how many you use. So if we want to take a look at a numerical example, we've got a monthly charge, in this case, of $40. Variable cost is 3 cents a kilowatt hour, and we used last month 12,000 kilowatt hours. What's going to be the total amount of our bill? Well, it's going to be the $40 of the fixed cost plus the 3 cents times the amount used in this case, which is the 2,000. So our monthly bill is going to be $100. couple of different ways people can come to looking at it or reviewing it. The accountants will just look at it on an account by basis, look at the bill, whatever. An engineer, on the other hand, may very well do a study, an engineering study of some sort, to find out what the direct materials are, the direct labor is, manufacturing overhead, and come up with a calculation like that. I'm going to do this chapter in 2 units, and that's going to conclude the first part of the lecture for Chapter 1. Thank you.